Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sangamo Road Trip. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the Director and Curator of the Sangamo Experience here at UIS. And we have decided to do something a little different today. Last time we were visiting, we discussed the history of Curran, Illinois, and we changed to a different format. So then it was a bit more live and also allowed us to have our viewers ask questions and dive a little bit more into the local history here in Sangamon County. For those of you who are new, this is the Sangamo Road Trip. And what we've been doing is we've been traveling from one town to the next here in Sangamon County, discovering the rich local history, but only scratching the surface. You see, we're getting a feel of all the different towns, and we are journeying from one area to the next to discover the individuals who are passionate about their town, who want to share the local history, but also by observing some of the buildings that are still standing within our city centers throughout Sangamon County. And there have been some towns that have had a bunch of rich information, historians and historic societies that have come out and have been on the road trip with us, such as Dan Dixon, and we have John Alexander from Burden. But there are some communities that we have still yet to find some of those residents who have the rich history stored within their local knowledge. And so that's why on this road trip, we've been scouring Sangamon County, trying to find those key individuals who have rich stories to share. And today, we are ending our road trip here in Springfield, Illinois. And the reason why we're not traveling in the downtown area is because I actually have someone very special coming on to the show today, who's going to discuss some of the rich stories that he's been able to dig up in regards to Sangamon County. But today he's going to focus on Springfield, Illinois, and Springfield history. And he is with the Sangamon County Historical Society. He's the editor of Sangamo Link. And I'm going to bring him on in. His name is Mike Kinzer, and he's going to discuss with us a little bit about some of his research. Hi, Mike.
How's it going?
It's going good. Surviving COVID.
Nice comments. Appreciate it. Sangamon Link is indeed part of the Sangamon County Historical Society's mission to help people learn more about local history. So we appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you for being on the show. I'm going to make some short announcements before we dive on in. Here on Sangamo Road Trip, we may have some questions along the way. So as you're watching the show, excuse me, feel free to type your questions in the comments. And also, what I like to do on all the videos that we do is, as you listen in, let us know where you're from. Where are you listening from? Are you here in the Sangamon County area? Are you from outside of Illinois? Just let us know so then we can gain a better idea of how you formed a connection with the central Illinois area. So Mike, today we are here to talk about Sangamon Link, and specifically Springfield, Illinois. But before we get moving, can you give us kind of a little bit of a background on how Sangamon Link got started and pretty much your journey from then to here?
Well, Sangamon Link actually is an outgrowth of an idea from Nancy Chapin, and you're sort of an outgrowth of Nancy Chapin too at your position with Sangamo Experience. But Nancy just recently died. She had the bright idea about 10 years ago to do an updated Sangamon County history. And at one point it was going to be a published book type printed history. And then I'm not sure who, I think Nancy again decided, no, they should make it online because that's the way the world is going these days. And also because it's cheaper to do, and you don't have to have the same obligations to make your money back. So in 2013, when I retired from the Journal Register, I knew about the plans for an online encyclopedia of Sangamon County history that the Historical Society had been discussing. And I came to the Historical Society with the idea that I would take this on for a little bit of walking around money, but mainly because it's fun and interesting. I'm a Springfield native myself, and grew up through a lot of that history, unfortunately, these days at my age today. And I approached the Historical Society with the idea of me taking it on as the editor. They accepted it. And so I've been doing this for close on to 9 years, 8.5 years now. Sangamon Link is up to almost 1,300 entries on all aspects of Sangamon County history, certainly not just Springfield. And when I say all aspects, I do mean all aspects. When I do a presentation in the community, a PowerPoint, my second slide, well, the way I lead into my second slide is that here's what Sangamon Link is not about. And that second slide is a picture of Abraham Lincoln. That's going too far. You don't do Sangamon County history without dealing with Lincoln and Lincoln's neighbors and the atmosphere that surrounded Lincoln when he lived here. But there's a lot more to our history here, and it's just fascinating. There's just so much rich stuff here. Thanks to Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, so much more of it is documented than there is in a lot of other places. So it makes my job a lot easier. So that's what we're doing. As I say, we're up to about 1,300 entries. Sangamon Link is always free to read. We're always looking for new topics. When I started this, I thought, well, if I get to 1,000, 1,500 entries, I'll think will have covered the spectrum of possibilities pretty thoroughly. And that's not true. Every time I research one thing, I find out about two or three or more other things that I hadn't considered before. And so this may never stop. History doesn't stop, neither do we.
Well, that's a good statement is, history never stops, and we're creating it right now. I know that you've been around for a lot of the history, and Nancy was as well, that took place here in Sangamon County. And I think it's very important to research the local history, no matter where you're at, whether it be Sangamon County or somewhere else. And in Springfield, we tend to be a bit dominated by Lincoln, like you said. But if you look around at the architecture and the people who lived here, we have a lot more interesting individuals than we realize.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to narrow it down just a little bit and hopefully have you back on for some more adventures here with the Sangamon Experience. But for our Sangamo road trip, we are journeying to Springfield, Illinois. And so before we dive into some of your favorite articles that you've helped write over the years about Springfield, I want to kind of give our audience a brief picture of Springfield, Illinois and how it came to be. Originally, Springfield, Illinois was named Calhoun after Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. I'm kind of glad we were not named after him. He was a bit wild and crazy. But people who settled here in the Springfield, Illinois area were trappers, fur traders, and they came for the Sangamon River, which is what the Sangamon Experience is really named after, because the Sangamon River makes up a good portion of central Illinois.
Excuse me, Ann, I'm going to duck out for a second, be right back.
All right. So while I am continuing here, the area settled around the Sangamon River was basically like a spring patch, which where Springfield gets its name. And the first cabin that was actually built in the Springfield area was in around 1820 by John Kelly. And it was located around in the northwest corner of what is now 2nd Street and Jefferson Street. And in 1821, the city of Calhoun, which is Springfield, became the county seat of Sangamon County due to the the rich soil and also the trading opportunities. Many people who came here were from Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina. And what's interesting about Springfield, if you go to the Illinois State Archives, there are 3 incorporation papers that you will find. Because at one point, it was created as Calhoun, and then it was kind of a village and was incorporated in, later on as Springfield. And then by 1840, it was written up again for a set of new incorporation papers. If you're interested in those, I highly recommend you go to the Illinois State Archives, or hold tight for next year's exhibit where we will be talking about the 200th anniversary of Sangamon County. Now, as the town grew and the name eventually changed, you see that Sangamon County made up most of central Illinois, but started to dwindle down and be cut into other surrounding counties, such as Menard, Logan, and a few others. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the surveyors that ended up helping splice it into pieces. Now, some of the key points with Springfield, originally when it grew, it didn't have the large old state capitol that we saw downtown. Originally it was had dirt streets, a lot of cattle would come through eventually when the population started to grow, and the downtown square ended up turning into a marketplace. And the first market house was actually placed on what is now known as Washington Street in the middle of 6th and 5th. And that market house was put there, and then it was eventually moved. And what's really exciting is the farmers market has grown out of what was the market house. And Innovate Springfield just announced this year that there is going to be another type of market building on Adams Street near 4th Street, which will be so exciting because we'll have an opportunity to bring some of the history back to life with a new market building. Some of my favorite stories in Springfield are from the earlier days when the old market house was on between 5th and 6th on Washington, and it was known as Chicken Row. And that's where cattle was sold, produce was sold, so it wouldn't be uncommon to walk down the street and see a farmer bring his cattle into town. And that's what life looked like at the early parts of Springfield's history. And as we grew outside of the square that we now have today, the old Capitol Square. And as we grew out, more buildings were starting to be built, and neighborhoods such as Lincoln's became very diverse with Irish immigrants, German, and you also see a number of English immigrants coming into town as well. And so you have this diverse population growing around Springfield and making it grow into the city that we know today. And some of the places that we have discussed in regards to Sangamon County history here on the Sangamo road trip, such as Leland Grove, Curran, a lot of them have branched into Springfield. And we'll be getting to some of those other stories later on today. So I'm going to bring Mike back on to the show, and I'm going to have him talk about some of his favorite stories. And as I stated earlier in the road trip, we're only scratching the surface with these videos, and more are to come. And as we learn more and as more stories are brought to us, we will be able to share more of them as we experience Sangamon County and the Central Illinois area. So I'll bring Mike back on and turn it over to him.
Thanks, Ann. Well, yeah. As Ann said, the original idea of this was for me to pick 3-4 of my favorite Sangamon Link entries to talk about today, which I've done. But if I'd picked them on a different day, I probably would have picked a different four because there's just so much good stuff out there. I'll sort of go through these in chronological order briefly, and then I'll come back and give you a little more detail on each one. I'm starting with a lady named Gertrude Wright Morgan, who, as Gertrude Wright, her maiden name, was the first African-American graduate of Springfield High School, of the high school in Springfield at the time. There was only one. And she may have been, that's the lady right in the middle of that photo. She may have been actually the first African-American high school graduate anywhere in Illinois. Nobody's quite sure about that. She went on, for reasons I'll get into in a minute, to marry a fellow from Massachusetts who was also a groundbreaking African-American. And they became a couple of the most active civil rights advocates in Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts. Just an interesting story. I'll come back to it again. Secondly, on my list, the Springfield Survey, which in 1914 was just an unparalleled look at the lives of ordinary people and petty criminals and the insane and the poor, people who don't make it into the history books normally. But here in Springfield, we understand a lot more about what they lived through because of the Springfield Survey, a survey that was never, ever reproduced anywhere else in the country. Remarkable, unique document. Thirdly, is the fascinating story of the Sterneman brothers, Edward, nicknamed Dutch, and his younger brother Joey, who were history makers in both college and professional football. They were in the 19 teens. They both graduated from Springfield High School, football stars, went on to the U of I, and on into relative fame. We'll talk about them again a little farther too. And then finally, a story that sort of encapsulates the history of organized crime, if you will, in Springfield and Sangamon County from the 1900s all the way up into the 1960s. And that's an entry I did on the gambling problem in Springfield and Sangamon County in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and the investigation carried out by prosecutors George Kutrakan and Nelson Howarth that broke the back of what had been a wide open, vice-ridden city and county for pretty much the entire 20th century prior to that. These are stories I ran across in various ways that just became more and more interesting the more I got into them. So let's go back and we'll talk, as I said, in chronological order, about Gertrude Wright Morgan. As I said, she was the first African-American graduate of Springfield High School. She ranked actually third in her class. It was a small class of 28, but she ranked third. And she was just, she gave a speech at commencement that the newspaper made a point of praising, saying she was a quote unquote credit to her race. She was obviously a very intelligent woman, very self-motivated woman. She got some of that from her father, Thomas Wright, who was born a slave in Missouri. And by the time Gertrude graduated, had become a relatively wealthy for that time, certainly for an African-American of that time in this neck of the woods. He was a landowner. He owned a couple of farms. He had done himself proud, and his daughter went on to do the family proud again. The problem was she wanted to be a teacher when she graduated from high school, and a lot of teachers were just high school graduates at that point, if that. But Springfield did not hire Black teachers, and they continued not to hire Black teachers until 1955. And so it drove a woman who could have been a spectacular addition to the Springfield community away from Springfield, sent her down to St. Louis, where she became a teacher at a high school called Charles Sumner High School, which was the first high school west of the Mississippi River that accepted African-American students. And because of its status as a unique high school, it drew intellectuals, Black intellectuals from all over the country, from the East Coast especially, to come there to teach. And one of the teachers was a young man named Clement Morgan out of Massachusetts. And he only taught there a couple of years in the early 1880s, at the same time when Gertrude Wright was teaching. And then he went back east, where he became the first African American to receive degrees from both Harvard University and Harvard Law School. And he became the first Black man elected alderman anywhere in New England, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They must have had some sort of long distance relationship for 15 years between St. Louis and Boston, because in 1897, Clement Morgan came back to St. Louis, and Clement and Gertrude were married on the farm near Rochester of one of Gertrude's brothers. And then they moved back to Cambridge, where Clement had been working and practicing and being active. And they became associated with W.E.B. Du Bois's Niagara movement, which Du Bois was more militant than the other leading outspoken African-American leader, Booker T. Washington in those days. Du Bois, Washington was pretty accommodationist. Du Bois was more militant and about wanting to obtain equal rights for African Americans. And so he formed the Niagara movement, which was in response to Washington's approach to things. It didn't last very long, but Gertrude Wright Morgan became the leader of the women's part of that. I'm not sure they had an official women's auxiliary, but she was the women's leader of the Niagara movement, which was a big deal. W.E.B. Du Bois was a big deal. And Clement Morgan was also involved in the Niagara movement too. It didn't last very long, as I said. And once it folded, however, they went on and helped found, the two of them, the NAACP chapter in Boston, Massachusetts. And they continued to be activists for African-American rights, Gertrude also for women's rights, through their entire lives. They're buried in the Boston area. They're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has a Morgan Avenue that's named after Gertrude Wright Morgan. The cemetery where they're buried donates to the NAACP Empowerment Fund in the names of Gertrude and Clement Morgan. And they are fairly famous back there in Boston. I'm kind of proud of this entry in Sangamon Link, because I believe I was the first person, certainly the first person in this neck of the woods, to tie together the first African-American graduate of Springfield High School and Gertrude Wright Morgan, leading African-American woman activist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Second, as the second of my favorites, at least my favorites of the day, the Springfield Survey. The Springfield Survey was just an amazing thing. Survey studies were just a beginning sort of idea back in the early 20th century. The city of Pittsburgh had an in-depth study, and then a foundation based in New York City. And I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me. I can't remember their name. It'll come to me in the middle of this presentation, I hope. Thought, well, let's do a smaller city the next time. And they came to Springfield because one of the children of Governor John Palmer had done a survey here of water service and sewer service in Springfield, and found that there was all sorts of problems causing cholera and innumerable diseases because of interconnections between sewer lines, water lines, wells, outhouses. All these sort of things were just, stirring up a mass of germs. At any rate, we'd done that survey, and based on that, the foundation from New York thought, well, we can do a broader survey of all sorts of social conditions in Springfield, and so they did. They came here in 1914, a half dozen people from the New York survey. They enlisted more than 100 people, almost all of them women, not quite all, but almost all of them women, to go out in the community and find out things about how the jails operated, how the schools operated. Schools were a big part of it. What the park system was like, what city government was like. Just one thing after another. The various social services, the Home for the Friendless, which was the orphanage / senior citizens home for poor people at the time. They went into these things in incredible detail. They went to every classroom in the Springfield Public Schools. They talked to every teacher. They even went to houses of prostitution and studied the the price rates. If you're really interested, the prices range from $1 to $5 in the local houses of prostitution. And they outlined how the various blocks in the city would have red lights in front of some of the houses indicating they were open for business. They went to billiards parlors, which they found were just dens of iniquity, and they attacked them. What you're seeing is a photo of the city bullpen, where essentially the drunk tank of the city jail. The only place where anybody could lay down was in those 3 cells. They had some bunks in there, and the bullpen sometimes housed as many as 50 people at a time. They went out to the Sangamon County poorhouse, the poor farm out near Buffalo, and reported on the people who lived there and what kind of their accommodations were like. They covered almost every aspect of Springfield social conditions, with the notable exception of largely of racial discrimination. They only mentioned racial attitudes and racial discrimination in 1 spot, 2 spots really. This is a picture of a house in one of the African-American neighborhoods of the city. That's a young black boy in front of the house. You can see what kind of shape it's in. They did mention that the housing conditions for African-Americans were even worse than for working white people, and those were pretty bad to start with. They examined families. They studied how coal miners lived from day to day. You only worked part of the time when you were a coal miner. The rest of the time, that is in the mines, the rest of the time you had to scuffle. Your wife had to take in boarders, perhaps, or work as a seamstress or a laundress. Your kids probably had to work. It was just a mess. Hang on just a second. Good to go. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Sorry, having a little plumbing crisis here at home and having to deal with that. The fellow just fixed it all up for me, so I recommend Easter Day. That small commercial. Take it easy. At any rate, the Springfield survey went into incredible detail. It lasted taking the survey numbers lasted several months. And they packaged their results up in 10 pamphlets that were published then over the next about 7 years. The last one was published in 1921. They had a large-scale display at the Illinois State Arsenal, where the armory is now. It's showing what all they had determined. What you're looking at now are some posters they prepared for that display, showing where babies were born and when in 1913. To find that out, they had to do things like go to all the parish priests and ask them what babies they baptized, because there was no central record of births. You weren't automatically listed somewhere. You didn't automatically get a birth certificate. It was real groundbreaking research, and they came up with a list of recommendations for what the community should do to improve various situations. Things as nitty gritty as making sure blackboards in schools were at the level of the kids, not just the height of the teachers. Going to a lot more complicated types of things, such as how to deal with women in the workforce and stuff like this. They outlined some 40 improvements that were made in just that first year. And a lot of things that they recommended never came to pass. The poor farm continued to operate. The jails didn't get a lot better. But the fire department did go to mechanized equipment instead of horse-drawn stuff, and the schools did adopt a lot of the suggestions. But the really intriguing thing for me about the Springfield survey is once they did Springfield, nothing like this was ever done again in any community in the country. So you can go back to the Springfield survey results, and I have links on Sangamon Link's entry on the Springfield survey. I have links to all 10 of the other volumes, the smaller volumes in the survey, where you can read everything that the surveyors reported, and you can see what the recommendations were, and you get a sense of what life was like for, as I say, people who never made it into the history books in most cases. People, the poor, the mentally ill, the feeble, the insane, the common laborer. You get a sense of their life in Springfield that you can't get anywhere else in the world, really, certainly anywhere else in the nation at that time. Moving on to a third quote-unquote favorite entry. The Sterneman brothers, Dutch and Joey, graduated from Springfield High School in about 1915, 1919. Dutch was the older one, Joey was younger. They went on to the University of Illinois. They were both football stars there. And then I'm gonna take a little detour for a minute. Dutch Sterneman got hired by the Staley soybean processing plant over in Decatur, mainly because he could play football for the Decatur Staleys, which was the company football team. It played against teams from small towns around central Illinois. And it was coached, of course, in its later years by George Halas, who went on to become the coach and owner of the Chicago Bears. And Dutch Sterneman played for him and moved with Halas from Decatur to Chicago when the Bears were formed from the Staleys. Well, as I say, I'm going to take a little detour for a minute because Joey Sterneman, a couple years younger than Dutch, was playing at the U of I. He was a sophomore. He starred in the U of I's upset win over Ohio State as a sophomore, and he was all set to become the starting quarterback as a junior the next year. This would have been about 1920. But that year, the towns of Taylorville and Carlinville got arranged for a football match between the two teams. It was part of a series. Taylorville had won the game the year before, and Carlinville was out for revenge. So what Carlinville did was, and this was not all too common back in those days in football, Carlinville hired the entire Notre Dame football team. And these were Newt Rockney's boys, so they were pretty good. And everybody in Carlinville started betting on the Carlinville Democrats was their team name. And Taylorville could see what was going on. And so the Taylorville coach went out and recruited most of the University of Illinois football team led by Joey Sterneman. And so they met in Taylorville, I think it was in Taylorville, in November of 1920 or 1921 for this big grudge match. Maybe $200,000 was bet by both sides in total on this game. It was a huge deal. And in the first half, Taylorville got a one touchdown lead. And then, but the Notre Dame guys on Carlinville's team figured, well, we can match that in the second half when we bring our boys in. So they brought the Notre Dame team in the second half. But when the Taylorville team tried it out, they were all different too. They were all the U of I players. Joey Sterneman had tape sort of strategically stuck on his face so he, quote unquote, wouldn't be recognized apparently. He kicked 3 field goals and Taylorville won 16-0. When the news media around the country heard about it, first of all the players from the two colleges who played in the game were expelled from their teams. I don't know if they were expelled from school, but they got thrown off their teams. Some just outstanding stars, people who were nationally known, couldn't play college football anymore. Among them was Joey Sterneman. And so he went on to the Bears with his brother. And meanwhile, the college football began setting up rules on on amateurism and barring people from being paid to play even in non-college games. Well, so Joey Sterneman joins the Bears, where Dutch Sterneman is by now George Halas's assistant coach and co-owner of the Bears. Eventually, George Halas realized that if he made Dutch Sterneman a half owner of the team, he wouldn't have to pay him to be a halfback. Dutch was one of the leading scorer a year or two. And then when Joey got there, between the two of them, they before Red Grange became a member of the Bears, Dutch and Joey led the team. They scored like 3/4 of the team's points one season. They were really good players. Dutch was a halfback. Joey was the quarterback. And this went on for several years. Joey had his ins and outs with the team and with Halas, and I guess with his brother. But Dutch remained half owner of the Chicago Bears until the Depression started. And the Bears were losing money. Dutch had some off-season jobs. They were losing money too. And so it came down to they couldn't afford to have two owners. The only way it was going to make it is if ownership was united with one of them. They sat down with each other, and according to the story put together by the Sterneman family, they put in blind bids. Whichever of the two guys, George Halas or Dutch Sterneman, bid the highest would become the owner of the team. And the rule was nobody except the two bidders and their lawyers would know how much each one had bid. Well, we do find out that George Halas offered to buy out Dutch Sterneman for $38,000. We don't know what Dutch's offer was to George, but apparently Hallis's bid was the higher one because he got the team. And Dutch Sterneman was out in the cold. After 10 years of coaching and co-owning the team, he settled for his $38,000 and went away and went into the oil marketing business, gas and oil marketing business. And George Halas kept the team. And as we know today, he got the better of the deal because the Halas family still owns most of the Bears. And the latest estimate I've been able to find from a month ago is that the Bears today, that $38,000 investment is worth $3.5 billion. That could have been Dutch Sterneman's $3.5 billion if he offered a little bit more money, apparently. And then finally, my 4 favorite stories, we'll talk about the big gambling bust that took place in Springfield in the 1940s. And I say bust, it was a long-term battle to wipe out gambling, or at least reduce gambling in Springfield, that had been going on for years and years. And one of the reasons I picked this one is because until you start doing some looking into local history, you don't realize how wide open in terms of vice, gambling, prostitution, violence in many ways, starting back with the race riot and even before that, there was in Springfield in the early 20th centuries. It was a nasty town. You had coal miners blowing things up, opposing sometimes the mine owners, sometimes other miners. You had shootouts in the streets of Springfield over coal mine political issues. You had the Italian, I'd say Italian, not just Italian. There were Italians, Lithuanians, a number of crime syndicates. The Irish were all involved in Springfield at various times. And when Nelson Howarth got back from the war, he was later the mayor. When Nelson Howarth got back from serving in the Navy in World War II, he said, there were prostitutes and gambling being purveyed in the middle of downtown Springfield all the time. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing evidence of how wide open this city was. Well, finally, in 1948, out on the outskirts of town, out on Peoria Road, across from the fairgrounds, just east of the fairgrounds, a crime syndicate thug named Lenny Giordano had his throat slit and he was shot in the head and found dead. And his roommate was found dead a few weeks later. And for some reason, after all the mayhem that had taken place in Springfield through all those decades, this one was the last straw. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch had started doing some investigative journalism here in Springfield, examining just how it was that all these gambling outlets were able to stay open as publicly as they were. Between the Post-Dispatch and the murder of Lenny Giordano, they determined that Sheriff Meredith Rule, who's a great story in himself, I won't go there, but he was a legitimate hero in World War II. Sheriff Meredith Rule had been keeping a closed eye to all the gambling that was going on. The worst of it was around the edges of Springfield, not necessarily within city limits, but practically the city of Springfield. He had ignored it. The Post-Dispatch asked him about how it was that these places could stay open as widely as they were. And he said, well, things happen. They said, did you ever get any money from, any of the gamblers? Were you being paid off? And he said, well, I can't, maybe somebody gives me money because they like the color of my eyes. And the Post-Dispatch reporter said, that isn't usually why people give you money. And then he said, well, I never said I actually got any money. And the mayor, Mayor Eielson, who again has a separate entry on him, he was a legitimate sports hero sometime after the Sternemans were. Mayor Eielson in the city of Springfield likewise said, well, I guess I should shut down some of the big casinos, but you have all the VFWs, the Knights of Columbus, the American Legion, they're running their back parlor poker games and their punch cards and that stuff. And that's been going on since long before I was here. Why should I do anything about it? So you could see what the public officials' attitude was towards vice in Springfield, which was basically, it brings in money. People are going to get mad if I shut down some of this stuff, so I'm just not going to get them mad. At any rate, George Kutrakan, became the state's attorney. He was elected over the do-nothing state's attorney who was previously in office. He hired Nelson Howarth. They started doing their own raids, leading raids themselves without telling the cops sometimes where they were going. And gradually, some of this started to shut down. The Post-Dispatch found that places were paying off something like $10,000 a week to a crime syndicate led by a gentleman named Frank Zito, who probably a lot of you have heard of as quote unquote Springfield's godfather. There's an entry on Frank Zito and his three brothers, all of whom were involved in the crime syndicate to some extent, on Sangamon Link as well, separate entry. Frank Zito supposedly was the guy who would sit at the St. Nicholas or Leland hotels and just, as people would come up and slip him envelopes full of cash. Post-Dispatch supposedly had a reporter in the restaurant where this was taking place at one point and saw all this happening. A grand jury investigated it. They said, well, things are bad around here, but, there's no evidence that any of the public officials really had anything to do with it or were benefiting from it. That all this was, some of this was just a pipe dream cooked up by the Post-Dispatch's informant. So they sort of kissed it off. Frank Zito never spent a day in jail for involved with any gambling stuff. He had a little bit of federal time back in the 1930s because of prohibition violations, but he went to his deathbed without serving any more time in jail. He did have to appear before the U.S. Congress's Mafia Investigating Committee after he was arrested at the notorious Appalachian meeting in New York State of mob figures. And he pleaded not being able to understand the English language. There's some fairly comical byplay between him and the attorney leading the investigation for the Congressional Commission, Robert Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, that is, that guy. At any rate, it made for, it was, as I say, sort of the culmination of just how bad vice had gotten in Springfield. It was so wide open that finally the rubber band got stretched too far and it snapped back. And gradually, over the next 15, 20 years, a lot of the worst elements of vice culture in Springfield was shut down. So those are the four things I picked. As I said, I could have picked all sorts of other ones like Rags, the dog who rode the interurban train system between Bloomington, Decatur, and Springfield for 6 years with people treating him nicely. There was a huge train station shootout, sort of a Bonnie and Clyde thing at what is now the Amtrak station in Springfield in 1923, an attempted mail robbery. There's the soybean train that brought soybean culture to farmers throughout the county. There are just so many things that I could talk about that Sangamon Link has covered. I'm sure I'll be covering more of it. But if you guys want to talk about any of this or ask any questions about these or anything else I have on Sangamon Link, I'd be glad to answer.
Thank you, Mike. I know personally I've enjoyed reading Sangamon Link because as I've been going on the road trip, that's where I've been getting most of my information is by going through Sangamon Link's articles and trying to discover more about the surrounding area. My big question for you is, do you see Sangamon Link expanding a little bit more outside of Springfield with its storytelling? Because I've noticed that there's a lot of Springfield stories connected within Sangamon Link.
Well, obviously you do a lot of Springfield, like you do a lot of Lincoln. They're the big dog in the fight. But no, one of the things that I would have chosen to talk about today, if we'd gone beyond the county, was a fella from, I want to say out in the Pleasant Plains area, maybe Chatham area, who actually preceded Lewis and Clark into the great Northwest. Just another fascinating story that I ran across, that I was tipped to by a fellow over by Decatur. But this guy was a fur trapper, and when Lewis and Clark went on their fabled expedition in 1803, 1804, he was out there already, and he met Lewis and Clark was going out when he was coming back, and they ran into each other and interacted somewhat. So There is a lot of stuff there, but yes, it is Springfield centric because Sangamon County is frankly Springfield centric. And a lot of the stories that, when the Rochester State Bank was held up, the robbers fled into Springfield, and you had another Bonnie and Clyde chase with people shooting machine guns out the car windows as they drove down the highway between Rochester and Springfield. It's one thing after another. It's tied together. Pawnee is a great story. Pawnee created their own railroad to transport coal. There is a lot out there.
One of the things I saw in some of the Springfield groups, so like Springfield Memories, and there's another one, just History of Springfield, Illinois. They talked a little bit about the Lauterbach guy, and I thought that was interesting because they were trying to figure out who remembers certain restaurants, who remembers certain neighborhoods that were put in place, schools. And I always find it really interesting to see the individuals go back in time and try to remember the school years. But as you've done some research, what would you say was a very interesting interview that you've done while working on Sangamon Link?
It's not so much interviews. I spend a lot of time with documentary stuff, and there are great interviews on the, originally done by the ancestor to UIS, Sangamon State University. Those sorts of interviews. I tend not to do. I've done some interviews over the years, but not that much. I tend to delve into the old newspapers and other old records, city directories, material up at the Sangamon Valley Collection, which is just a fantastic resource, as you know. So I'm much more of a document guy as opposed to a talk to him guy, if that makes sense. And to a large extent, that's because, the people I'm interested in, the issues I'm interested in, there isn't anybody left to talk to about.
Well, it's definitely been interesting to kind of go through some of your favorite stories, and the list, I know it goes on and on because it's kind of like trying to pick your favorite child. You don't really have one. So now that we have concluded talking a little bit about some of the stories from Springfield, Illinois, we're going to open it up to anyone who has any questions for Mike in regards to Sangamon Link or some of the stories that he talked a little bit about. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. And also let us know if there are any stories that you think Sangamon Link needs to include on their Encyclopedia of Sangamon County History. I know that, Mike, you're not just the only person who submits stories. You have some other people that submit articles to you, correct?
Absolutely. Bill Salini Jr. Has been a great contributor. He lives in California now, but he has a lot of interest in Sangamon County history, and he's always coming up with ideas for me and writing stuff for me, which I encourage that. Anybody who will do some of my work for me, I'm in favor of. If you have a topic that you think is worth exploring and you'd like to write it, by all means, get in touch with me. My email address is on Sangamon Link. And then, Curtis Mann at Sangamon Valley Collection has a couple of areas of special expertise. He writes about local mills, and he wrote a lot about various local breweries. We've had some one-hit wonders. One woman wrote about Willard Ice, the namesake of the Willard Ice building downtown, because she works there and wanted to know more about him. And when she found out more about him, she thought he was worth an entry, and she wrote it up, and it was just great. So, I'm not only interested in ideas, I'm interested in people submitting articles. We can usually work with them. And there's some instructions on how to go about submitting stuff to Sangamon Link, but basically talk to me and I can lead you through it too.
Are there a lot of articles on architecture in Sangamon County?
We do have quite a few, just finishing up a pair of them, as a matter of fact, here this last week, about the old state capitol. Its beginnings as really the state capitol, which I didn't get into too much, but back in the 1890s when, Sangamon County Courthouse took over the old capitol after the new capitol was built. In the 1890s, Sangamon County raised the old capitol 11 feet in the air and stuck a new floor under it, making it 3 stories instead of 2. And in the 1960s, the state of Illinois, which had acquired the building back, lowered it back down, took that new first story out, new century-old first story out, and restored it to the way it looks in Lincoln's period. And all that was, both of those, raising and lowering, were incredible architectural and engineering feats. And I just did a couple of entries about them based on an idea that actually Bill Cellini Jr. suggested to me. So yeah, and there are a number of spectacular local buildings, local homes especially. Did one on I want to say the Price something house in Williamsville, the Caldwell Mansion out towards Chatham. They're all over the county. I haven't gotten to them all by any means, but there are quite a few there.
Well, thank you, Mike, so much for all your hard work on Sangamon Link. I know that it's been a jewel of discoveries, and sometimes I find myself just getting lost going through all the articles because I find each one interesting as I go along. And as I've been on this journey discovering more about the county itself, it's been very fascinating to have such a rich resource available that, like you said at the beginning, a lot of other counties don't really have that. So thank you so much for putting that together, and I'm looking forward to what other articles you're going to be putting within Sangamon Link. And I'm going to end with us basically showcasing some of the interesting facts that we can find within the Sangamon Link. And what I would like to do is, if you have a story and you want to get in touch with Mike and you can't seem to find a way to get a hold of the Sangamon County Historical Society and become a member, feel free to reach out to Sangamon Experience, and we'd be more than happy to put you in touch with everybody. We would love you to join the Sangamon County Historical Society and help contribute, as well as using the Sangamon Link as a resource to help us better understand Sangamon County.
Thanks very much, Ann. Appreciate it.
Yep. And make sure to check back with us as we go on this journey. So, sorry. Next year marks the 200th anniversary of Sangamon County, and I strongly encourage you to look back at the Sangamon Experience, because we will have a new exhibit highlighting all the different towns and villages and areas around the county itself. If you are interested in being a part of that exhibit, if you are a county, a town or a city or village or incorporation within Sangamon County, reach out to us. We want you to showcase your hometown pride by helping us celebrate the 200th anniversary of Sangamon County. So come back and to stay tuned to what's to come for the big anniversary of Sangamon County next year, and stay tuned to our Facebook and social media pages to learn more about this rich history of Central Illinois. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again.